Warning strobes painted the freighter's lower decks in harsh, rhythmic flashes of crimson. The primary coolant line had ruptured in Sector 4. Atmospheric sensors registered 318 Kelvin, a thermal threshold that liquefied murky internal organs in a matter of minutes. The automated evacuation klaxons were deafening. Vriss scrambled toward the reinforced bulkhead, his scales already crisping and fracturing from the ambient heat. He glanced back through the thickening haze, fully expecting to see the human mechanic dead on the deck gratings. She was not dead. She was untying her jacket. If you think surviving the void is the hardest part of deep space navigation, you haven't seen what happens when the life support systems turn against you. Stay close. 20 minutes ago, the most pressing crisis in the subbasement had been deciding who was buying the first round of nutrient paste at the next port. Amara had settled the dispute with a flick of her thumb. The small, circular disc of stamped human metal arced through the sterile air of the engine room. It landed with a sharp ping on the primary console, spinning before settling flat. Tails. Amara smirked, scooping the token back into the pocket of her grease-stained overalls. Vriss had officially logged the object as a frictional diagnostic tool during his initial inventory audit. As a newly promoted cargo supervisor, he relied heavily on the procedural manuals. He simply did not understand the human concept of entrusting financial obligations to gravity and a piece of zinc. To Vriss, the engine room was a place of delicate balance and precise thermal regulation. To Amara, who claimed she had previously worked in something called a sub-basement boiler room on Earth, the massive fusion drives were just loud, overgrown heaters. A low hiss, then a violent shudder in the deck plates. Vriss looked up from his datapad. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the freighter's main drive had shifted pitch. It was a subtle acoustic variance, but to a species with highly sensitive auditory canals, it felt like a physical pressure against the skull. He tapped the environmental monitor on his wrist. The numbers flickered from a stable, comfortable 285 Kelvin to a cautionary amber 295. The secondary coolant reservoir had bypassed its regulatory valve. Before Vriss could key the comms to alert the bridge, the primary manifold screamed. A jet of superheated vapor vented directly into the upper gantry. The temperature gauge in the room did not climb. It vaulted. 300 Kelvin. 305 Kelvin. The automated safety protocols engaged immediately, dropping heavy containment shielding over the delicate navigation arrays. The main blast doors at the far end of the corridor began their agonizingly slow descent. 30 Mreki crew members, mostly junior technicians and cargo handlers, were in the immediate vicinity. Their physiological response was instantaneous and catastrophic. Mreki biology requires a cool, heavily moisturized environment. At 305 Kelvin, the ambient moisture on their skin evaporated, causing agonizing microfractures along their dermal layers. Their respiratory slits flared, desperately trying to pull oxygen from air that suddenly felt like breathing crushed glass. Panic erupted. Technicians dropped their diagnostic tools and surged toward the closing blast doors. Vriss felt his own secondary heart begin to palpitate erratically. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. The air tasted of ozone and burning dust. He pushed himself away from the console, waving his primary arms to herd the younger crew members toward the exit. The temperature monitor on the wall flashed a blinding red 310 Kelvin. Vriss was frantically running the biological math, calculating that they had exactly 42 seconds before their secondary cardiovascular systems boiled in their chests. A sharp, metallic clang echoed through the corridor as Amara kicked a jammed conduit panel near the fusion manifold. Vriss stumbled, his optical membranes stinging as the moisture burned out of his eyes. He turned his head, fighting the overwhelming instinct to flee. Through the distortion of the superheated air, he saw the human. She had not moved toward the exit. She was standing directly beneath the ruptured vapor line. "Amara!" Vriss rasped, his vocal cords tearing from the dry heat. She didn't look at him, She was wiping a layer of liquid from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She reached up and grabbed the collar of her heavy work shirt, pulling the fabric away from her neck and exhaling heavily. "You've got to be kidding me." Her voice carried over the klaxons, sounding more irritated than terrified. "The decontamination alarm has been screaming for 4 minutes. I'm sweating through my best shirt. It's like a swamp in here." Vriss reached the threshold of the blast doors. The heavy metal barrier was inches from the floor, locking down the sector to prevent the thermal spike from spreading to the rest of the ship. He collapsed onto the cool grating of the safe zone, his scales bleeding from a dozen microfissures. He twisted his body around, looking through the thick, thermal-resistant glass of the viewing port. Inside Sector 4, the temperature crossed 318 Kelvin. A lethal, unsurvivable environment. The human was still inside. The command center on the safe side of Sector 4 was silent except for the ragged, wheezing breaths of the surviving crew. 30 Mreki technicians huddled together against the far bulkhead, their scales flaking, their respiratory slits laboring to process the dry, recycled air. Vriss ignored the stinging in his own dermal layers. He dragged himself to the primary security console, his digits trembling as he bypassed the automated lockdown overrides to access the internal monitoring feeds. The monitor flickered, fighting through the intense electromagnetic interference of the superheated vapor. Static washed over the screen in violent waves of gray and black. Vriss held his breath, bracing himself for the gruesome visual confirmation of the mechanic's demise. The feed restored. She was alive. Amara stood exactly where he had left her, bathed in the violent crimson light of the warning strobes. The temperature readout overlaid on the camera feed ticked steadily upward. 319 Kelvin. 320 Kelvin. At this threshold, the ambient heat should have cooked the fluid within her ocular cavities. The proteins in her muscle tissue should have been undergoing rapid denaturalization. Instead, she was leaning casually over the primary relay box. She reached up again, gripping the heavy, synthetic fabric of her collar. She tugged it forcefully away from her neck, exposing a sheen of liquid pooling on her skin. Vriss stared at the monitor in absolute horror. He knew the human possessed a remarkably dense skeletal structure, but this visual defied basic thermodynamics. To a species evolved on the perpetually shaded, moisture-rich plains of a twilight world, the structural resilience of a cardiovascular system built entirely around an iron-heavy blood matrix and the ability to excrete water directly through the dermis seemed less like biology and more like dark magic. Vriss recalled a buried file in her personnel record, a footnote mentioning that her species originated on a Deathworld with extreme environmental variables. The file had referenced deep-sea volcanic vents and subterranean cave systems, where temperatures naturally exceeded boiling thresholds. He had assumed it was hyperbole, a simple translation error in the interspecies database. It was not a translation error. She wasn't melting. She was just annoyed. The massive freighter shuddered violently, dropping Vriss to his knees. The secondary containment field was buckling under the thermal pressure. If the vapor lock wasn't relieved, the fusion manifold would detonate, taking Sector 4 and the rest of the ship with it in a spectacular stellar bloom. Vriss keyed the emergency intercom, his voice a frantic, clicking rasp of desperation. "Amara, the ambient thermal load is lethal. You must evacuate immediately. The sector is collapsing." The audio feed cracked with heavy static. "Give me a minute, Vriss." Her voice echoed back, sounding out of breath and immensely irritated. "The humidity is destroying my hair, and this override fuse is completely slagged." On the monitor, she finished shrugging off her heavy outer jacket, dropping it carelessly onto the scorching deck plates where the synthetic fibers immediately began to warp and blacken. She had found the source of the malfunction. The main relay bridging the coolant system and the backup generators had blown completely. The gap in the circuitry was wide, the copper contact points charred black and useless. She stared at the fried circuit board, her shoulders slumping in a display of utter exasperation. Vriss watched her rigid posture, his scientific mind calculating that the sheer overwhelming trauma of the heat had finally overwhelmed her nervous system, triggering catastrophic thermal shock. Then she reached into her grease-stained pocket, pulled out the stamped zinc coin, and jammed it directly into the exposed, high-voltage gap. A blinding arc of electricity surged through the camera feed. Vriss flinched, throwing his arms over his face as the monitors whited out completely. The command center plunged into darkness as the localized power grid shorted. For 3 terrifying seconds, there was nothing. Then, the heavy, vibrating hum of the deck plates ceased. Slowly, the violent, erratic thrum of the ship shifted back to its comforting, rhythmic baseline. The auditory assault of the evacuation klaxons cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in the command center. On the wall monitor, the blinding red 320 Kelvin ticked down to amber, then dropped rapidly to a stable, cool 285. The automated containment protocols disengaged. The blast doors hissed, rising incrementally to reveal the cleared corridor, the superheated vapor already cycling out through the atmospheric scrubbers. Later that cycle, Vriss updated the official manifest. He deleted her designation as a standard mechanic, quietly reclassifying the human as a Class A strategic asset. Down in the cooled engine room, the primary console hummed perfectly. Wedged tightly between the scorched circuitry, bridging a gap that should have destroyed the ship, the small zinc coin caught the ambient light, locked forever in place.